Have you ever faced a situation where you felt misjudged, ridiculed, and as if no one believed in what you were going through? Imagine being just an ordinary woman, but the moment you step into the courtroom, you are no longer just the accused. You are the leader of one of the most powerful organizations. What would you do if the very officers you once trusted mocked you in front of thousands? Elise Morgan's story will keep you on edge with every passing second, and it just might change everything, not only for her, but for anyone who has ever been pushed into the shadows of injustice. Would you dare to stand up as she did? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to follow stories that will make you think twice. The courtroom was thick with suffocating silence. Every step Chloe Brown took echoed against the cold, unyielding floor, each sound carrying the weight of an entire world. She entered the chamber, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, exuding confidence and composure. The light from the high windows cast warm streaks across the otherwise sterile and unwelcoming space. Every eye in the room was on her, yet none of them truly understood who she was. Chloe, a black woman, seemingly ordinary to those who didn't know better, carried a burden far greater than anyone in that room could comprehend. Across from her, two officers, Ridley and Thompson, sat at the prosecution's table, exchanging smug glances. Their sneers dripped with arrogance, convinced that this battle would be effortless, that Chloe was nothing more than another defendant walking into a trial she couldn't possibly win. They thought humiliating her would be simple, that they could strip her of her dignity right here in this very courtroom. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Chloe was not just another defendant. She was the head of the Department of Homeland Security. She wasn't here to cower under their scorn. She was here to turn the entire case on its head, to expose the secrets they thought had been buried long ago. The truth was about to hit them harder than they could ever anticipate, dismantling the very illusion of power they believed was untouchable. As she stepped further into the room, the air itself seemed to grow heavier. A sense of unease settled over the spectators, like the brewing of a storm not yet visible, but undeniably present. Chloe took her seat, not as a helpless defendant awaiting judgment, but as a warrior stepping onto the battlefield. Her gaze scanned the room, locking eyes with each person, silently demanding the answers that had long been left unspoken. Ridley and Thompson remained oblivious. They failed to realize they were facing an adversary far greater than they had prepared for. All they saw was a black woman, an assumption that would soon cost them everything. Chloe remained calm, her resilience quietly reverberating throughout the room. She wasn't afraid. She was not someone who could be silenced, not someone who lacked a voice. She was the head of one of the most powerful government agencies, and they had gravely underestimated her. But the truth had yet to unfold. With every passing second, tension thickened like fog, suffocating and inescapable. The officers' sneers only fueled Chloe's determination. She knew that one misstep could jeopardize everything, that a single mistake could allow them to regain control. But her silence, her unshaken composure, only heightened the suffocating weight in the room, as if an impending storm loomed just above them. She was no ordinary opponent, and soon that fact would become painfully clear. Ridley and Thompson thought they held power in their hands. They assumed control rested in the voices that spoke the loudest, the fists that hit the hardest. But Chloe was about to show them otherwise. Power belonged to those who knew how to wait, those who understood that silence could be the deadliest weapon of all. As the courtroom doors closed behind them, Chloe knew that this was more than just a trial. This was a battle not only for justice, but for the very idea of fairness itself. This story would not end the way those officers had envisioned, and by the time it was over, they would no longer just be facing a woman they had underestimated. They would be facing their reckoning. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating, a heavy weight pressing down on everyone present. The high windows allowed streaks of light to cast sharp contrasts against the serious, anxious faces in the room. Each person in attendance held a sense of unease, as if they knew something monumental was about to unfold, but couldn't quite grasp what it would be. Chloe Brown stepped into the courtroom, her every footstep echoing like a declaration of war. The navy blue suit she wore exuded authority and composure, yet the eyes that followed her were not filled with admiration or respect. Instead, they carried doubt, skepticism, and perhaps even disdain. Only a handful of people truly understood what was about to happen, but not everyone had realized it yet. Mark Ridley and Dave Thompson, two police officers seated at the prosecution's table, were the first to sneer. They exchanged knowing glances, their expressions dripping with condescension. Ridley, a hulking figure whose very presence demanded attention, gazed at Chloe as though she were nothing more than an inconvenience, an overconfident woman walking into a battle she could never win. Thompson, younger and more arrogant, barely concealed his amusement, a smirk tugging at his lips as she entered. They thought this would be easy. To them, Chloe was just another woman, just another black defendant, just another person challenging their power, a challenge they believed would be swiftly crushed. But their mockery only thickened the air, a warning sign of what was to come. Chloe was not someone who backed down. Every step she took was deliberate, carrying the weight of defiance and determination. The whispers from the spectators, the scoffing from the officers, none of it fazed her. She knew who she was, and more importantly, she knew why she was here. Justice demanded a cost, and fear was not a price she was willing to pay. Today was not the day to cower. Today was the day to fight. The unease in the room intensified as she took her place before the court. The skepticism in the eyes of the jury and spectators was expected, but for Chloe, this was not just a legal battle. It was a fight against deeply ingrained biases, against the barriers that had long been built against people like her. They could mock her all they wanted, but they didn't understand that even in silence, she was preparing for war. She could feel the pressure in the air, the weight of every judgmental stare. Her heart pounded, but not with fear, with resolve. She met the gaze of Ridley and Thompson, two men who had laughed at her presence, and she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. They didn't know it yet, but they were standing on the edge of their own downfall. This wasn't just about her. This was for every person who had ever been underestimated, every voice that had been silenced, every individual who had been judged for their skin color, their gender, or their place in society. This was the moment to prove that justice was not dictated by false authority, nor could it be buried beneath sneers and dismissive glances. As each second passed, the tension in the room grew thicker. The question loomed over everyone. Could Chloe rise above this? Could she dismantle the lies, the assumptions, the prejudices that had been set against her? Could she break through the web of deceit that Ridley and Thompson had so carefully woven? This was more than just a trial. This was a reckoning. Chloe was not just facing the forces that sought to tear her down. She was facing the battles within herself. She knew that victory wasn't just about the legal arguments she would present. It was about changing the way people saw her, the way they saw power, the way they understood resilience. And as she prepared to answer the court's first questions, she could already feel the shift. The expressions in the room were changing. The doubt was still there, but so was curiosity. And by the time this trial was over, Chloe Brown would ensure that no one ever questioned whether she belonged in this fight. As she stood, No one could predict what would happen next, but the revolution had already begun. The trial progressed with an unbearable tension, each question and response carrying a weight that seemed to press down on the very air in the courtroom. Silence had settled over the room, thick and suffocating, as though no one dared to breathe too loudly. Chloe sat motionless, her expression unreadable, but inside her, a storm raged. Every gaze in the room was locked onto her, waiting for her to speak, to react. But she remained steadfast, refusing to let even a hint of fear seep through. Across the courtroom, Mark Ridley and Dave Thompson sat at the prosecution's table, their smugness barely concealed. Their confidence dripped from their every glance, every smirk. They were certain of their victory, convinced that Chloe would crumble beneath the weight of their fabricated accusations. But they had no idea that, in this very moment, the truth was beginning to unravel. Gregory Holtz, Chloe's defense attorney, rose from his seat, his steady presence slicing through the suffocating atmosphere. His voice was deep and measured, carrying a quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. Your Honor, what we present today is not just a defense, it is a revelation of the truth. Chloe Brown is not a criminal. She has committed no wrongdoing against these officers. She is merely a citizen who found herself targeted in a situation where law enforcement overstepped its boundaries. Gregory's gaze swept across the jury, his unwavering stare challenging them to see beyond the carefully constructed facade of the prosecution. He continued, his words deliberate, each one landing with undeniable force. The reality is this: these officers acted improperly. They operated with bias, with unchecked authority, and perhaps even with malicious intent. Chloe Brown did nothing more than ask why they were in her neighborhood. She sought clarity, transparency, basic rights granted to every citizen, and for that she was treated like a criminal. He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle over the courtroom. Chloe watched him, her heart pounding, but not with fear, with anticipation. A flicker of hope stirred within her. She had fought so hard to get to this moment, and now the truth was being spoken aloud for all to hear. Gregory was not just defending his client, he was dismantling the very foundation of the prosecution's case. He was exposing the hypocrisy, the prejudice, the systemic failure that had led them to this moment. The officers who had wrongfully accused Chloe could no longer hide behind their badges. The cracks in their story were beginning to show. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Those who had once been skeptical now found themselves second-guessing. The unwavering certainty that had once filled the prosecution's table had begun to waver. Then, Gregory delivered the question that changed everything. Can we, as a society, continue to allow people like Chloe to be treated this way simply because they dare to demand accountability? The silence that followed was deafening. The jury exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The weight of the question hung over them all, demanding an answer. In that moment, something shifted. Chloe Brown was no longer just a defendant. She was a symbol of resistance, of courage, of the fight for justice. The truth was no longer confined to whispered conversations or buried evidence. It was here, in this courtroom, forcing its way into the light. Gregory returned to his seat, casting a look of quiet pride toward Chloe. The trial was far from over, but the tide was turning. She was no longer the one on trial. The system was. Tension thickened the air, pressing down on the courtroom like an invisible weight. Chloe Brown could feel the weight of every gaze fixed upon her, each one filled with scrutiny, waiting for her to stumble. The courtroom was packed, as if the entire world had gathered to witness her fall. But she was not one to break. Though her heart pounded and a flicker of unease stirred in her chest, She stood tall, unwavering. Every step she took toward the witness stand was deliberate, her chin held high, her resolve unshaken. The murmurs and insults from executives and accusers still lingered in the air. She could hear their disdain, the exasperated sighs that barely concealed their doubt, and the cold stares meant to pierce through her. But none of it mattered. Chloe knew she was not just fighting for herself. She was standing for those who had been silenced, for those who had been dismissed, for those who had been told they didn't belong. She wasn't an enemy. She wasn't a threat. She was a woman demanding respect, demanding fairness, demanding truth. The jury sat motionless, their expressions unreadable. The executives refused to acknowledge the weight of the moment, clinging to their arrogance and the belief that they could erase her voice with sheer intimidation. But Chloe saw through them. Their words were nothing more than the echoes of fear, the fear of losing control, the fear of a world where people like her could no longer be ignored. She was not their shadow. She was the storm they never saw coming. Her footsteps rang against the polished floor, each one a declaration. I will not be afraid. I will not back down. The condescension of her accusers could not shake the core of who she was. They could not rewrite her story. They could not make her disappear. Then something unexpected happened. As she reached the stand and met the eyes of the jury, a deep silence spread across the room. The hostility, the mocking laughter, it all faded. For the first time, something shifted. Maybe it was the unwavering strength in her posture. Maybe it was the undeniable truth reflected in her gaze. Whatever it was, it made people pause. Chloe allowed herself a small, knowing smile, not out of satisfaction, but because she realized that today was bigger than just her. This moment, this stand, would echo far beyond these courtroom walls. It was a beacon for every person who had ever been told to stay silent. Endurance is not about staying quiet. It's about knowing when to stand up. The thought resounded within her, steady and unbreakable. The accusations, the cruelty, the judgment, they could try to break her, but they had only made her stronger. She was not their victim. She was their reckoning. They want me to stay silent. I will not. I will speak the truth. The conviction in her heart burned brighter than ever. Every word she spoke would not just be a defense. It would be a declaration. No one will erase me. No one will erase the truth. A heavy stillness hung in the air before Gregory Holtz, her attorney, rose from his seat. He scanned the jury, then turned to Chloe, his expression filled with pride. She had already won the most important battle. Facing her fears, facing the prejudice, and refusing to be diminished by a system built to suppress her. The people in this courtroom may have failed to see Chloe Brown's worth, but she knew the truth. No force, no institution, no bias could ever overpower the strength of resilience and the relentless pursuit of justice. The courtroom was thick with tension, every breath from the jurors absorbed into the heavy silence. All eyes were fixed on Carmen Williams, the witness whose testimony had just shifted the entire trajectory of the trial. No one could have predicted that her words would carry the power to turn the case on its head. Carmen, a retired school teacher in her 60s, stood tall with quiet resolve. The room fell into an almost sacred silence, as if the stillness itself could influence the weight of the words she was about to speak. She had never stood in a courtroom before, never faced such an intimidating atmosphere, but today, Carmen knew she had to. What she was about to say would change everything. Her hands trembled slightly, but her gaze remained steady as she looked toward the jury, then turned to meet the eyes of the officers, Ridley and Thompson, the very men who had confronted Chloe Brown. Beads of sweat dotted her forehead, but they were not signs of fear. They were the product of unwavering conviction. She knew that her testimony held the key to breaking the suffocating silence that had buried the truth for so long. "Your Honor," Carmen began, her voice steady and resolute. "On that day, I witnessed Chloe do nothing wrong. She simply asked a question, a reasonable, simple question. What are you doing here?" She wanted to understand why the police were in our neighborhood. Her words hit the air like a hammer against the walls of doubt. The mask of ambiguity that had clouded Chloe's case began to shatter. A single question, innocent, logical, had somehow spiraled into a battle for justice. No one in the courtroom had expected this. Carmen, calm yet piercing in her delivery, recounted the details of that day. She described how Chloe had stood there, merely seeking answers, without aggression, without hostility. She spoke of the silence that followed Chloe's inquiry, the way the officers had chosen not to provide an explanation, the way their presence had loomed over the neighborhood without reason. Her words carried weight, dissolving the fog of misinterpretation that had surrounded Chloe. Slowly, the atmosphere in the courtroom began to shift. The rigidity in people's postures softened, and the lines of suspicion on their faces started to fade. Chloe, once portrayed as a defiant aggressor, was now seen for what she truly was, a woman seeking the truth. With every sentence from Carmen's lips, the weight of false accusations crumbled. For the first time since the trial had begun, Chloe felt something different, understanding. The tide was turning, and it was not fueled by fiery protests or loud outbursts, but by the quiet, unwavering force of truth. The executives and officers remained stone-faced, but something flickered in their eyes. Doubt. A moment of unease. Had they misjudged her? Had their actions been an overreach of power? Had they been so quick to assume that they had, in fact, been wrong all along? Carmen's unwavering testimony left them no room to hide. This trial was no longer just about Chloe. It was about justice. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or labeled simply because of who they were. Carmen had not just defended Chloe, she had stood up for fairness, for the principle that every voice deserved to be heard without prejudice. As Carmen stepped down from the witness stand, the energy in the courtroom had transformed. The jurors no longer looked detached. They leaned in, engaged, listening. The air was no longer suffocating with tension, but charged with something else: hope. This case had become bigger than Chloe Brown. It was about everyone who had ever fought to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. And now, the only question that remained was, would justice prevail? The answer was not yet clear, but one thing was certain. Truth had finally found its voice, and the world would never see this case the same way again. She was not just another woman walking into a courtroom filled with pressure. She was a Black woman, clad in a navy blue suit, standing tall like an unyielding flame against the darkness. Anyone who laid eyes on her at that moment would see a woman of strength. But beneath Chloe Brown's confident gaze lay an unexpected twist, one no one could have foreseen. The courtroom was packed, from the jurors to the spectators, all of whom had witnessed Chloe's unwavering determination throughout the trial. But none of them knew the full truth yet. She wasn't just a defendant. She was the one holding the key to a battle that went beyond herself. It was a battle against the system. As Chloe slowly rose to her feet, her eyes didn't just meet the jury's. They locked onto officers Mark Ridley and Dave Thompson. They had no idea that this very moment would unravel everything they thought they knew. About Chloe, about themselves, about the power they thought they wielded. She inhaled deeply, as if preparing for a seismic shift, and when she finally spoke, each word left her lips like a bullet, sharp, precise, and powerful. "Your Honor," her voice rang out steady and unwavering. I am not just another defendant. I am the head of the Department of Homeland Security, appointed by the federal government. The words sliced through the air like a thunderclap, freezing every breath in the room. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. The mockery, the condescension, the prejudiced assumptions that had surrounded her throughout the trial, they all crumbled into dust within seconds. Chloe was no mere accused woman in their eyes anymore. She was a symbol of authority and justice. The revelation struck like a masterfully played twist, reshaping the entire landscape of the trial. The officers who had once regarded her with smug amusement now felt the ground shift beneath them, their arrogance drowning under a wave of impending reckoning. The silence in the courtroom became deafening, the tension rising to a nearly unbearable peak. It wasn't just those within the courtroom who were shaken. Journalists stationed outside began murmuring in hushed, frantic whispers, cameras flashing as they rushed to relay the explosive development. Chloe, unwavering and composed, stepped fully into the battle, no longer just fighting for herself, but for something far greater. She was ready to dismantle everything that had hurt her, her family, and countless others who had suffered under the weight of systemic racism and injustice. Chloe was not merely fighting for fairness in a single trial. She was fighting for those whose voices had been silenced, for those cast aside by a system designed to exclude them. She stood not just as a high-ranking official, but as a beacon of hope for millions. The truth had arrived, and there was no turning back. Her declaration was not just a warning to Ridley and Thompson. It was a statement to everyone who had ever abused their power to suppress the vulnerable. She was not someone to be dismissed, and she would not be belittled any longer. The realization dawned upon everyone in the room. This was no ordinary trial. This was the battle of a woman fighting for truth, for justice, and for something greater than herself. Chloe's dignity wasn't just affirmed in her words, but in her stance, in her very presence. She stood, unwavering in the face of prejudice, in the face of ridicule, without a single falter. And in that moment, she could feel the tide turning. Hope was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was roaring back to life. Justice would not be forgotten. And in that moment, Chloe knew her life had not been lived in vain. She was not just the head of the Department of Homeland Security. She was the leader of a revolution against injustice. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence, as if time itself had stopped. Every eye in the room remained fixed on Chloe Brown, the weight of her revelation crashing down like a thunderbolt. Her words had shattered the smug arrogance of the two officers seated at the prosecution's table, Mark Ridley and Dave Thompson. Before this moment, they had viewed Chloe as just another defendant, an easy target for ridicule and belittlement. But today, Chloe had obliterated that illusion. As she revealed her true identity, a suffocating tension gripped the room. No one, neither the jury nor the press, could comprehend the magnitude of what they had just heard. Chloe Brown was not just any woman standing trial. She was the head of the Department of Homeland Security, one of the most powerful officials in the government. And the two officers, who believed they were in control, now found themselves sitting across from a woman who could destroy their careers and freedom with a single decision. All eyes shifted to Ridley and Thompson. The light in the room seemed to intensify, exposing the overconfidence and condescension they had displayed throughout the trial. But now, as the truth settled in, their expressions contorted with shock, disbelief, and rising panic. They were no longer confronting an accused woman. They were confronting someone who held the power to dismantle everything they thought was untouchable. Chloe stood unwavering, her gaze locked onto them, and for a moment, an almost suffocating stillness filled the room. Even the air felt dense under the weight of the tension. Ridley, once so quick to sneer, now sat frozen, unable to utter a single word. Thompson, always so assured of his control, now fidgeted in his seat, his composed facade cracking. They could see it in Chloe's eyes. There was no fear, no hesitation, only an unbreakable resolve. Chloe's story had transcended that of a mere defendant. She had become a symbol of resilience, a warrior standing not just for herself, but for all those who had been cast aside by those who abused their power. She was no longer just fighting for justice. She was fighting for every person who had been silenced, every individual whose rights had been trampled underfoot. And now, men like Ridley and Thompson could no longer hide from the truth. The seconds stretched unbearably long, the pressure mounting with each passing moment. The accusations, the threats, the deceitful tactics employed by Ridley and Thompson, none of it could shield them any longer. The entire courtroom was transfixed, watching as the once confident officers now struggled to maintain their composure, but their growing anxiety betrayed them. They knew they were no longer the ones in control. Chloe was. And then, with every statement she delivered, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as the weight of the truth became undeniable. The people had been fooled by Ridley and Thompson's manufactured authority for too long. Now, the truth was laid bare before them. Chloe was not just another victim. She was the victor. She stood there, unwavering, while the truth blazed through the courtroom, like the sun cutting through the darkest storm. A spark of hope ignited among those who had long suffered in silence. No matter who you were, no matter the obstacles placed in your path, even as a Black woman in a society riddled with prejudice, you could rise, you could fight, and you could win. Chloe, with her unwavering strength, had proven it. She wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing for every person who had ever been forgotten by an unjust system. Chloe's final glance at Ridley and Thompson sealed their fate. They could no longer escape the consequences of their actions. Fear crept into their expressions, not just for the outcome of this trial, but for the future repercussions that awaited them once their sins were fully exposed. The chains of arrogance and oppression had begun to break, and nothing would ever be the same again. And it was Chloe Brown, the woman they had underestimated, who had made it happen. When Chloe Brown stood before the court, she was not just an individual. She was the leader of a revolution, a force of change poised to dismantle an entrenched system of corruption. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, every gaze locked onto her, as if no one could believe what was about to unfold. With unwavering strength and conviction, Chloe unveiled a restructuring plan she had meticulously prepared for years. But this was no ordinary plan. It was a calculated purge, a fierce battle to eradicate the individuals who had suffocated justice and fairness for far too long. Chloe's voice cut through the silence like a blade. The time for change is now. The reign of corruption in this company is over. Her words struck like a hammer against the fragile egos of those who had abused their positions of power. Names like Daniel Hall, Michael Clark, and Sophia Wilson, individuals who had clung to their authority for years, were now confronted with an inescapable truth. Chloe did not hesitate. She made it clear they were no longer fit to lead, and she was removing them from their seats of influence. A suffocating stillness enveloped the room. Every heartbeat pounded in unison, no one daring to exhale. This was an unforeseen twist, something no one had dared predict. Who could have imagined that a Black woman, once dismissed and ridiculed, would stand here today, stripping away the power of those who had manipulated the company and oppressed honest individuals? With unwavering resolve and unshakable determination, Chloe turned a long-awaited dream of reform into reality. As she moved forward, she made sure to lay out exactly who would take the place of those being removed. Names like Charlotte King and William Turner, individuals of integrity and steadfast moral character, were positioned as the new leadership. This was more than a simple personnel change. It was a defining moment that would usher in an era of transparency and justice. A renewed sense of hope surged through the room, a wave of anticipation rippling through the crowd as employees realized that their company was no longer a safe haven for the corrupt. Each individual in the courtroom felt the weight of the moment. The fear that had once stifled their voices dissipated. No longer would they have to live under the oppressive rule of those who wielded power with impunity. The way Chloe commanded the room, her unflinching decisions, inspired everyone present, especially those who had long fought for this change. A newfound connection bound them together in this battle, a shared realization that they were witnessing a true turning point. Yet, amid the rising hope, the faces of Daniel Hall, Michael Clark, and Sophia Wilson painted a stark contrast. Their once smug expressions had drained of color, replaced by shock and barely contained rage. Their eyes flickered with fear as they grasped the reality that they could no longer hide behind their authority. Every word from Chloe was another strike, severing the chains that had allowed them to rule unchecked. The entire room sat in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of the shift that had just taken place. And yet, there was an undeniable sense of regret lingering in the air, a sorrow for the lost opportunities, for the years spent in darkness while the wrong people sat at the helm. These mistakes could never be undone, but Chloe had ensured they would never be repeated. The exposure of corruption was not just an ending, it was a new beginning, a necessary sacrifice for a future built on fairness and truth. Chloe was no longer just a leader within the company. She had become a symbol of resilience and transformation. Her fight was not just for herself, it was for the countless individuals who had been exhausted by injustice, for those who had spent too long watching from the sidelines. She was the beacon of light for those yearning for real change, and she had delivered it, not through empty promises, but through bold, uncompromising action. This story was not merely about removing the corrupt. It was about connection, unity, and the power of standing together for a common cause. Chloe had done the impossible, and the impact of her actions would reverberate far beyond the walls of that courtroom. She had proven beyond any doubt that truth and perseverance could shatter even the most formidable injustices. After the trial ended, Chloe didn't have a moment to breathe a sigh of relief. The admiring gazes of those around her had not yet faded, but she had already returned to her work with an unshakable determination. Her fight did not end here. She knew she had won a significant battle, but the real war was still ahead. She continued her journey of reform, not just to set an example, but to protect the fundamental rights of every individual. The hope she had ignited, not only for the employees in her company, but for all those who had endured injustice, fueled her strength. Chloe's promise to uphold justice and prevent the system from repeating its past mistakes became the guiding torch for a fairer future. Yet, Chloe's empathy remained unwavering. She sensed the concerns of those around her, the people who had stood by her, who believed in her and in justice. Hope was no longer just a word. It had become tangible actions that she had to carry out every day. While many placed their trust in her, she knew the path ahead would not be easy. Those who thrived on corruption and manipulation would not relinquish their power so easily. The question lingered in her mind. Would things truly change? Could she uphold her promise and ensure that these injustices never happened again? Though Chloe stood firm, moments of doubt crept in. Still, she refused to let them deter her. Every step she took was a declaration of the values she believed in. Amidst all the challenges, her love for justice and for those around her remained a powerful force driving her forward. Chloe knew she was not alone. Each day brought a new battle, but she would never give up. She would continue fighting for a just system and for those who needed her to stand up, no matter how arduous the journey. Chloe stood there in a courtroom filled with curious and questioning eyes. Finally, after countless struggles, tireless battles, and weary steps on the road to justice, she had reached this defining moment. Standing before a changing society, Chloe knew this was not just her victory. It was a victory for those who had been forgotten, ridiculed, and oppressed. It was a victory for the values of justice she had fought to uphold for so many years. Though the path had been difficult, Chloe felt a surge of anticipation rise within her, like a great wave crashing onto the shore. She knew that justice was not a simple word. It was pain, loss, and the destruction she had witnessed. But above all, justice was hope. It was something every person deserved, no matter where they came from, what color their skin was, or what position they held in society. The faces of those who had been overlooked, mocked, and discriminated against still haunted her. But instead of letting regret consume her, Chloe turned her pain into motivation. She looked around the room, seeing the trust and hope in the eyes of those who stood with her. They didn't see her merely as the head of Homeland Security. They saw her as a symbol of justice and change. "Justice is not just my right," Chloe said, her voice strong yet filled with emotion. "Justice belongs to everyone who has been ridiculed, discriminated against, and oppressed. I stand here today not just for myself, but for every individual in this society who deserves fairness and respect." She paused, allowing her words to echo through the room, a message powerful and undeniable. "No matter the cost, I will never stop fighting for justice. This is the path I have chosen, and I will walk it until no one else has to suffer these injustices." She turned and walked out of the courtroom. And while she knew her journey was far from over, Chloe felt a powerful certainty rise within her. Justice would prevail, and with people like her standing up, change would no longer be a distant dream. It would become a reality the world could no longer ignore. In that moment, those who witnessed her didn't just see a strong woman. They saw a symbol of hope, fairness, and profound love for humanity. Chloe's story is a testament to the power of justice, courage, and perseverance. The lesson from her journey is clear. Nothing is impossible when we stand firm for what is right, even in the face of challenges, ridicule, and prejudice. Justice is not just an abstract concept. It is action, a fight to protect the rights of the weak, the marginalized, and the oppressed. Chloe did not just stand up for herself. She stood for all those without a voice, those who could not defend themselves. She proved that anyone, regardless of their position, can create monumental change if they dare to stand up and speak the truth. The most important lesson we learn from this story is that resilience and commitment to justice can transform an entire system. Sometimes one brave individual is enough to ignite the flame of hope for an entire community. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.